Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is the third part of our coverage of the Vince McMahon documentary called Mr. McMahon, which aired September 25th on Netflix. In this episode, we will explore Vince McMahon's relationship with various women. So this is the crux of the documentary for a lot of people. This is the jumping on point. This is lawsuits, exploitation, affairs, manipulations, all these sorts of things that take place within the 6-part series. You get a lot of conversation about Vince and women, most notably how Vince uses them on screen and some of the situations he dealt with off screen. Now, as usual, there were things missing from this section. Noticeably absent was the Fabulous Moolah, Mae Young, and Chyna. These were 3 people who are very important, who were absent. The Fabulous Moolah used to provide the talent for WWF women's division. Of course, she used to train these women. There's a lot of stuff about her too, but they decided not to veer off into that, where they could have connected Vince with the abuse of some of the women who were trained by Fabulous Moolah, how she took advantage of them, whether that be sexually or financially or whatever. I'm surprised they decided to withhold their disgust for that. So that was absent. The Chyna situation. Of all of the wrestlers that they showed that passed away, very young, Chyna was not one of them. She was not mentioned. She was not mentioned in the Stephanie Triple H relationship part, which she plays a very important role. She was not mentioned in the Attitude Era, where she also played a very important role. Chyna not being mentioned, very suspicious to me. But we got everybody else. We got Rita Chatterton, we got Janelle Grant, we got Ashley Massaro, we got Sable, we got Trish Stratus. And all of these come with their own baggage. We even mentioned Nancy Argentino in the story at one point. And Rita Chatterton, of course, is the big one that is mentioned, and the one serious issue that they talk about, but they don't talk about it at length. They basically just play Rita's appearance on Geraldo. That's pretty much what they do. And the accusation that she put out there, and Vince responded to it. So for those of you who are not familiar, Rita Chatterton claims she was forced to perform oral on Vince, and then he forcefully applied himself to her. She went on television supposedly about 5 or 6 years after the affair, went on Geraldo Rivera, said that she was raped by Vince McMahon. Now, Vince's response was that it was crap and that the affair was consensual. And then he could, instead of stopping right there, he said, well, even if it was rape, the statute of limitations had run out. And an untold number of sites just clipped out, if it were rape, the statute of limitations ran out. This is why I get kind of agitated about women's issues, because people get really sensitive about it and they take things out of context. A lot of it being consensual was left out on the table. If you didn't watch the entire thing, that part is almost glossed over. But they do mention later in the episode that New York City enacted a law that allows people to go after accusers, no matter how long ago the crime was. And Vince settled with Rita Chatterton. And it's an interesting situation Because for a long time, only a few people actually believed Rita Chatterton's story. She waited 6 years, and then the reason why she waited 6 years didn't make any sense. It was like she was friends with Andre the Giant, and she wanted to wait until Andre passed away first. So this wasn't as big of part of the story as I thought it would be. But it set the table. Because at this point, we're in episode 2, where they're talking about Rita Chatterton. There's also episode 2, where they talk about Jimmy Snuka and Nancy Argentino being beat to death. And this plays into the larger context that Tony Atlas said, how they abused all the hell out of all of the women. How they mistreated all of the women. All of them did. And that, of course, sets the stage that women have been mistreated throughout the entirety of the WWE. Then we fast forward to the Attitude Era, and episode 4 comes along, and we're talking about exploiting women in the content. The bra and panties matches, the mud matches, the bikini contests, all this stuff. And everyone's there talking about WWF's drastic change in demographics. They're no longer trying to appeal to children. They're now trying to appeal to older college-aged males, 18 to 34. And the 18 to 34-year-old male is interested in women. The sexier the product, the better the product. The more that was shown, the more interest the males had. Dave Meltzer comes in and starts talking about Sable. That Sable was one of the top draws in the Attitude Era, and her segments did big numbers, right up there with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And, of course, we all know Sable ended up suing the WWE for sexual harassment. But they did not contextualize the sexual harassment lawsuit. This is another one of those things where at the end, it says the WWE settled their lawsuit with Rena Mero, or Rena Lesnar. Now that's her name. But they left out the part about why she sued for sexual harassment. And it wasn't just sexual harassment either. It was like unsafe working conditions, unfair practices, a bunch of other stuff too. Her chief complaint really wasn't even the sexual harassment. That's just the salacious part that people hang on to. Her real issue was that she wanted to go do movies, and WWE controlled the intellectual property known as Sable, and therefore did not want her to go and do movies. So once she sued in order to get out of her contract, and she tried to go do movies, she tried to go to WCW, none of that stuff worked, so she came back. But the sexual harassment part, there apparently was two to three parts to that. Part 1 was that she was asked to be in a lesbian storyline, which she declined. 2 was that she was pitched an idea in which she would accidentally, on purpose, have her top ripped off or her gown ripped off or something in a segment that would lead to a feud with Deborah or something to that effect. And the third one was that there were men coming into the women's locker room, which of course could have been writers, but it's a lawsuit, so it's written to be salacious as possible. Of course, Sable came back in 2003. Vince, when asked about Sable and the lawsuit that Sable filed, he says he doesn't remember anything about Sable's lawsuit, but she came back to work, so, not a big deal, right? And to me, this is extremely tactical. It's extremely tactical. Because Vince remembers a lot. I mean, I know that sometimes, the guy's 80, and you're like, how much of this stuff can he really remember? Does he have dementia? Does he have some kind of other neurological disorder? But not remembering this lawsuit when he had to know it was coming up. Tactical. Why? Why would you say it's tactical? Well, who is his buddy? Brock Lesnar. And who is Brock Lesnar's wife? Sable. So he's not going to say anything bad about Brock Lesnar's wife. So he's going to pretend, I don't remember anything about that. I don't know anything about that. You know? Oh, I don't remember. It's very, very suspicious that the one lawsuit that involves one of your really good friends' wives, you don't remember that one. You don't remember that one, do you? Okay. Now, Trish Stratus is an interesting case because Trish is a lot more lenient, but had the same boundaries. Trish Stratus, in my opinion, did a really good job of humanizing Vince and humanizing what they do, making sense of what they do. The segment where she had to bark like a dog, of course that was going to come up. And Trish, of course, tells not the entire story, but she discusses how she became to be Vince's on-screen mistress. And basically it wasn't pitched to her that she was going to become Vince's on-screen mistress. It just sort of evolved over time, which makes sense because the Attitude Era a lot of it was week-to-week booking. You know, how could we take this character and do this week? And it became a long storyline between Vince, Trish, Shane, Stephanie, and Linda. And so it wasn't pitched to her that she was going to be one of his many on-screen mistresses. But she knew that the comeuppance was going to happen and that the barking like a dog segment was the lead up to that story. Now, for anybody who, I don't know, is familiar with stories, you know that sometimes characters are humiliated. Sometimes characters are demeaned and they get their revenge later, which Trish knew when they were going to do that she was going to get her revenge later. It wasn't going to go unpunished. But I particularly love the discussion about disgust. And that disgust becomes it's an emotion just like anger, just like sadness. Sometimes you can be just, ugh, this is sick. This is disgusting. It's evil, it's vile. And soap operas are like that. Soap operas are filled with evil and vile and sick people. But you continue to follow them. And you continue to follow their lives and their adventures and exploits. And the Vince McMahon, Trish Stratus, Linda situation was one of those disgusting things. Where you got this guy and his wife is in a wheelchair. She's catatonic and he's abusing her. You know. And it was interesting to me that a lot of the story for the documentary is who is Mr. McMahon, who is Vince McMahon, what's the differences. And wrestling always has people caught in the middle. Always. So people see this stuff, that Vince is cheating on Linda, that Vince is, using the talent to cheat on Linda. And they say this is a reflection of the real world. This is a reflection of the real situations that have been occurring. And Vince is denying it, of course. No, it's just character. It's just storyline. It's not that big a deal. Even though he's had on-screen affairs with a lot of different women. Which, of course, became the Vince McMahon character as being this licentious, exploitive, abusive male figure that now is abusive and exploitative in real life as well. But Trish understood that they were telling a story and that they were using people's legitimate disgust at Vince's real wife. People like it when it's real. It's his real wife. It wouldn't have worked as well if it wasn't. But Trish, being the person who was in that position, understood what they were trying to do and trying to explain it to outsiders. It's really awkward because I've never seen this for actors in movies or anything else. Most people they write off wrestling as it's just acting. It's not real. Why do you watch that stuff? It's fake. But then when something happens on screen, like somebody's wife kisses somebody else, it becomes, how can you do that? That's your daughter. That's your wife. That's your real wife. It becomes, but it's fake. It's not real. The kiss might literally be real, but it's acting. It's Hollywood. It seems other people get that stuff mixed up. It wasn't like Vince had Trish in a locker room on her knees barking like a dog. It was a segment in the middle of the ring. Now, the gem of a quote from Dave Meltzer that has been floated around from this. I'm going to read the actual quote because somebody tweeted it out. Meltzer says, quote, "I didn't like it when I saw it at the time, but the audience was young men who fantasized about hot women, but also kind of hated them because they could never get with them. So seeing them be demeaned was kind of perfect." That's his view of the barking like a dog segment. And there was some human thumb there by the name of Sharon Mazer, a writer. I guess she's interested in wrestling, a fan. And she talked about the complexity of the story, and I was very interested in that as Vince is demeaning this young woman and getting heat because he's mistreating her, he's also getting over with the audience because he's giving the male demographic what they want, which is Trish naked. They want to see Trish naked. They're not really caring how we got there, right? So I understood that, and I like that juxtaposition. I like that argument. And that's pro wrestling. That's movies and TV. You know, you may get what you want, but it's not the way that you want it. Yeah, you want to see Trish naked or whatever, but you don't really want to see her on her knees barking like a dog, being kicked around by Mr. McMahon. And for Meltzer to, I guess, psychoanalyze people he never met to say that, oh, they hated women anyway. It's like, no, this was the tone and tenor of the 90s. This was the tone and tenor of movies and television shows anyway. There was a lot of male humiliation on the WWF at the time too, whether in a storyline with Vince or not. Vince himself has been humiliated on television. They didn't discuss at all, Stone Cold Steve Austin making Vince McMahon piss himself, which is the ultimate in humiliation. Vince's various ass whoopings that he catches from other wrestlers, or, the Kiss My Ass Club, all these sorts of things, which the reaction is the same: to humiliate, to cause disgust in the audience, to make the audience feel bad for the person who's being forced against their will to do something that they don't want to do, or they're held hostage or something to that effect. The same sympathy that they apply to Trish Stratus, they don't apply to Shawn Michaels being forced to kiss Vince McMahon's ass, which is the same thing. The point of it was to feel sympathy for Shawn. That's the point. The point of Stone Cold Steve Austin hunting Vince McMahon down and forcing him to piss himself is different. It's a humiliation ritual for sure. But the difference is for Stone Cold Steve Austin to get some level of revenge on Vince for all of the slights that Vince has caused him up to that point. So humiliation is a completely and totally valid storyline element. And Trish was very mature in understanding that. And a lot of other people seemingly are very immature because they don't understand that. Trish Stratus also, interestingly enough, said that she was pitched a storyline to kiss another woman and she refused. And then she ended up losing her title, a short time later. And she says, hey, was it because I said no to this story or whatever, you'll never know. I don't think so, but you never know. So the Trish Stratus part of the story was very interesting. In episode 6, we get Ashley Massaro. Now, they mentioned Ashley Massaro's story about being raped over in the Middle East and the WWF covering it up, apparently. And then the follow-up story where Ashley claims that she was demeaned in storylines after turning down sexual advances from Vince McMahon, and they showed clips of Ashley and Vince on television doing an angle where she mistakenly spilled coffee over Vince, and Vince overreacted and suspended her indefinitely and all this kind of stuff. This episode 6 is probably the one episode where I felt they did the most damage to Vince's reputation overtly. And maybe because they wanted to spend all the time talking about the various lawsuits and NDAs, etc., that it makes sense to. And because Vince and the family, and literally nobody else except maybe Bruce, was even involved in this latter part. In episode 6, Vince almost vanishes completely. And they continue for like 30 minutes with nobody saying anything contrary to what the documentary is putting out there about Ashley Massaro. You know, they just say, oh, the company denied it. And then they move on. But they stack it on top of the Janelle Grant thing and the other NDAs. And they're stacking it with clips with Vince being licentious with other women, creating this portrait that there is this culture of women being abused and women not being taken seriously within the WWE. It came across very much like this portion of the documentary is meant to be used as evidence against Vince in the upcoming lawsuit or federal case or whatever that they're gonna. Let's put everything in one central place. Every accusation with no refutations put in place. You know? Again, Konstantin Kairos is a con man, the attorney for Ashley Massaro during the concussion lawsuit, which it would have been interesting had they mentioned that Ashley Massaro's statement was during a concussion lawsuit and not a standalone sexual harassment or rape lawsuit. It was during a concussion lawsuit. And then the letter, they did say this, that Konstantin Kairos, that con man, put out there was 10 years after the fact. You know? These things, they just rolled it all together because it was in the news at the time. When it popped up in the news, they just threw it in the documentary. They didn't, funnily enough, the documentary apparently was complete before, the Navy intelligence or whatever finished their report on what happened to Ashley, which of course they didn't find anything because it was, 20 years later or whatever. What can you find? What are you expecting to find? So not much there. They mentioned the tanning salon story. Apparently they didn't ask Vince about it because there's no commentary from Vince about it, even though it would have happened long before he did this sit-down interview, which means they could have asked him about it. And this is where episode 6 kind of really aggravates, because Ashley Massaro happened at a time where when you were speaking to Vince in 2021, you could have asked him about Ashley. You could have asked him about the tanning salon. There's a lot of things that they could have asked him about that was in episode 6 that they didn't ask him about, and they didn't show any footage or any refutation from the other side. Nobody said anything. They just started piling on all of these accusations. The tanning salon, Ashley, the NDAs. Now the NDAs and Janelle Grant, well, he's not going to talk about those anyway. That's ongoing litigation. He's not going to talk about that. The NDAs, he's put out statements on those already. You could have read his statements. I don't believe they did. But the tanning salon situation where he supposedly showed his naked pictures of himself to a woman, and Ashley Massaro, who apparently claims that she was raped overseas, they could have asked Vince about those, and they didn't. They had the time and the opportunity to do that, and they did not. I don't like for you to throw something, unless he was dead. If he was dead, there was nothing you can do about it. But he's very much alive. And you spent all this time on the Montreal screw job and the Monday Night War. You didn't get around to, hey Vince, what happened in that tanning salon in 2006? Hey Vince, I heard about this story about Ashley Massaro, this young lady. What happened to her? No, now we get 20 minutes of Shoemaker and Wall Street Journal reporters talking about things, and there is no response from the other side. No response. Outside of corporate statements. And am I saying that you shouldn't put those things in there? No. I think that the Ashley Massaro story is important enough for you to put in there. I think the tanning salon story, much like the Rita Chatterton accusation, is important that you put it in there. My problem is, did you not ask him? Or did you ask him and then cut the response? That's something that I'm very interested in. And then also, everything else that happened was happening in a timeline. There was a very linear way of telling the story. They started from Vince's childhood all the way through Vince's, accusations and when he stopped participating. The tanning salon situation was in 2006. Well, that was before Chris Benoit even happened. You could have talked about that before we even got to Chris Benoit. The situation with Ashley, it happened 10 years later in 2017. And both of those situations, you could have discussed with him what happened, what was going on, what are his thoughts about those things. Instead, it was all dumped into a part of the story where he was no longer participating, and apparently nobody else was either. An interesting quote that Vince says during the Rita Chatterton portion of the story is that once you're accused of rape, you're a rapist. This is an axiom that everybody knows to be true. Our society believes every single rape accusation, unless it's against a favorable figure like a Joe Biden or somebody like that, or a Bill Clinton. Otherwise, most people consider if they said it was rape, whether they can prove it or not. But we live also in a situation where people have been accused or even in some cases convicted of rape, and it didn't really damage their legacy at all. Kobe Bryant being a really good one. It destroyed Bill Cosby. It didn't really hurt Kobe Bryant at all. It's going to destroy Vince McMahon, but how much damage did it really do to the legacy of Tupac Shakur? Almost none. Obviously Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, all these people. This is the class that Vince McMahon is now being pushed into, and I think it's very unfair to do that. Especially since, unlike Bill Cosby and Tupac Shakur and Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, he hasn't been found guilty of any crimes yet. And I say yet, because who knows what could happen in 10 years. It seems unfair to me that that's the direction that everybody is going. That he is some kind of serial rapist. He's certainly licentious. Many a great man who has done many a great thing has been destroyed by poor dick discipline. The ego gets out of control. You're rich and powerful. You're in contact with beautiful women, and you have poor dick discipline. And that's the story of Vince McMahon going all the way back to the 80s. All the way back to Rita Chatterton, even before that. Him cheating on Linda all these many years is what caused this problem right here. So even though I am somewhat sympathetic to Vince, admittedly, I'm not going to say he didn't do anything wrong. If Vince McMahon had been a perfectly normal person with good dick discipline, who did not step outside of his marriage all these many times, who was not, so involved with his own gimmick that he started to believe it, he wouldn't have been in these situations. Most of these situations. Then the situation where Rita Chatterton doesn't even happen because he was married before Rita Chatterton he came into his life. The situation in the tanning salon, maybe it's a misunderstanding. We don't know what happened. But the situation with Janelle Grant and the NDAs, none of this stuff happens if he's a pious monk of a man who grows old like every other normal person. But he's not. He is different. And because he's different, he finds himself in all of these weird situations where his mind is, one of his two brains that he talks about is thinking about sex. And he's sex obsessed. And for him, sex is tied into having a lust for life. It's an interesting subject because it's not untrue. One of the weird things is that Vince is 80 years old. He was 70 some odd years old when he engaged in whatever kind of relationship he was engaging in with Janelle Grant. People are grossed out by the age differential alone. Before we even start talking about some of the details of what supposedly took place, just he was 70 and she was about 40. That grosses a lot of people out. The idea that Vince McMahon in his 50s and 60s would be on screen kissing young women grosses people out. And to him, it seems that he understands that, he knows that, he uses it, but it doesn't quite sink in when it comes to real life. But that seems to make what Vince McMahon makes him who he is. If he was normal, the WWE might have gone out of business in 1995. But he's not normal. If Vince did not listen to his audience and provide more sexual content, maybe the company isn't even around today. If he didn't, quote unquote, exploit women, would the company even still be around? If he didn't exploit women, then Sable wouldn't exist. Ashley Massaro wouldn't have happened. Trish Stratus wouldn't exist. And a lot of his drama and his troubles would not have occurred. So the exploitation of women is tied up in the fact that Vince listened to the audience, put himself with his poor dick discipline in contact with these beautiful fitness models and these Playboy playmates, and couldn't help himself. He had to at least do something on screen with them. And the crowd cheered it, booed it, was disgusted by it, but ultimately realized it's just on screen. But now the stuff's starting to leak off screen. And people are saying, well, now there's no difference. There's no difference between Vince McMahon on screen and Vince McMahon off screen, and he's trying to say that there is a difference. He has no similarities with the Mr. McMahon character. Well, that's very hard to see especially when you talk about it through the lens of women. That Vince McMahon on screen has his way with any woman he wants, and any woman who is against him gets destroyed. And then you see outside of the ring, pretty much the same thing happens. But that's also the perspective that you get just watching the documentary. Let me know what you guys think about this, and I'll talk to you guys later.